The topic of this lecture is Renaissance and the development of English literature in the 14th century England, a study in the context of contemporary history. Renaissance as such covers a considerable historical time frame. It started in 14th century in Italy, controversially in the late 13th century. It ran through the next two centuries and swept with its deluge of new learning and new writing over the entire Europe, mainly Italy, Spain, Germany, France, and last but not the least, England. The intellectual basis of the Renaissance was its version of humanism, derived from the concept of Roman humanitas. We must recall once more that Renaissance humanism, even though it is a movement, is primarily a syllabus. Uh, uh, Curriculum followed in the universities for the study of ancient Greek authors, and what more, it actually is the cultivation in new learning and new writing after the footprints of the great classical masters. But the real effect of Renaissance humanism was not felt in England till the middle of the 16th century and until Queen Elizabeth I ascended to the throne. Despite the fact that the universities of Oxford and Cambridge were officially functional during the time, this might demand another discrete space for discussing why the roles played by Oxford and Cambridge universities were almost zero in performance until early 16th century. In England, the Italian Renaissance undoubtedly exerted a significant impact on the literary practices of 14th century, but not in a large scale. The substantial effect of Renaissance is first observed in Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer's artistry and his sympathetic, philanthropic, and egalitarian view of mankind were much the result of his connoissance with the dynamics of Renaissance in Italy. The significant and substantial development in English literature as such started with Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry. With Chaucer, the English language underwent its journey from its medieval course to modernity. Chaucer is best known as the last among the medieval and the first among the moderns. Reading Chaucer's life history will reveal the fact that his diplomatic foreign missions to the countries of France and Italy were of paramount importance in shaping his literary and artistic taste and thereby helped in formulating his writings too. Indeed, Chaucer was the first man and the artist from England on record who came directly in touch with Renaissance movement that was fully operational in Italy and France during the last couple of decades in the 14th century. Another indisputable name fed with the succor of Renaissance is John Wycliffe. He was born in 1320, that is, he was 20 years senior to Chaucer, and died in 1384, that is, 6 years before Chaucer had died. He is also known as the Morning Star of Reformation in England. In fact, both Chaucer, the Morning Star of English Renaissance, as Edward Albert calls it, and Wycliffe are the two most illustrious stalwarts to whom the credit of the development of English literature much owes to. Their pedagogy was exceptionally influential in developing the English sense and sensibility and fixing a metric of standard for the ages to come. The translation of Bible, although in part from Latin to English by Wycliffe and his followers known as Lollards, published in 1380, controversially in 1382, was a phenomenal episode in the history of English life and culture and was the beginning of the Reformation movement in England and the sole cause of subsequent incorporation of Protestantism in England following Martin Luther's evangelical movement in Germany. Availability of Wycliffe's Middle English Bible, not in full but in parts, specifically the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, much contributed to the development of Middle English prose writing at one hand, and at the other hand was highly responsible for gradual receding of Old English mystery plays. Perhaps because people now could access Bible itself and understand it in their own way, and probably because there was no mystery any longer about Bible and Christianity. The genre was banned following the Reformation and the establishment of the Church of England in 1534. You will notice that this ban on staging of mystery plays in England saw the rise of morality plays. Anyway, now at this juncture, I will mention one important incident and its penetrative impact on the practice of language and literature and their overall development in England that immensely affected the contemporary literary practitioners of the time and beyond it. It is all about the pandemic of bubonic plague that caused the Black Death in England in the mid 14th century. It is interesting to notice that the bubonic plague was caused by a bacteria that originated in China. It is interesting because now at this present hour we are equally suffering because of the pandemic of COVID-19 that too originated in China. The bubonic plague, borne by the bacteria, is taken to have traveled all the way from China to southern England in 1348 via Silk Route, and its carriers were mainly the European merchants. By 1350, that is within 2 years, whole Britain was so badly infected by this bacterial disease that more than one third of the population had deceased. It was seen that the majority of the victims were rich people, including the priests of the churches, whereas the peasant class people who labored hard in tilling the lands under their feudal lords had survived mostly. This is indeed a very significant phenomena in the history of England for its larger and widespread effect on English socio-political as well as economic life. The priests died for they got contaminated during performing the compulsory last rites of a deceased body as per Christian ritual. When a large number of priests started dying, there was automatically a dearth of priests to perform the last rites in original Latin version. Therefore, England saw the rise of local priests under the aegis of John Wycliffe from among the peasants class people who recited the last rite hymns in English, specifically what we call the Middle English language, which was an officially discarded language since the Norman conquest in 1066 when French was declared to be the official language, as we all know. With the dearth of a large number of noble class people who mostly spoke in French and simultaneous rise of the peasant class people as the majority who used the Middle English for their day-to-day social intercourse, the demand for recognizing English language, the language of the common people in England, as the official language emerged for the first time. There was still a strong French lobby functional to denounce the demand of the common people, which however could not resist the Pleading in English Act that was passed in 1362. I repeat, the Pleading in English Act was passed in 1362 by King Edward III. It signified that English became the compulsory language for pleading in all the provincial courts of England, which uh, caused much trouble for the common people, for they did not know French. However, it was not until King Henry V in 1415 switched to the use of English as the language of the court of the king that it turned out the de facto official language of England, and so is the status till date. You must remember that Chaucer, who was born in 1340, was just a teenager during the time of Black Death in England, and he was 22 years old when this Pleading in English Act was passed in 1362. This must have been a very significant episode in Chaucer's life and development of his artistic sensibility and responsibility as well. Hence, at the beginning of this of his career, writing career, Chaucer, although well conversant in French, did not write anything in French. Rather, sharpened his caliber by translating some French masterpieces in Middle English language, including Roma de la Rose or the Romance of the Roses. This artistic venture in the field of translation literature by Chaucer was also part of his uh, uh, foreign diplomacy as well as the domestic one. Because he knew that at home people would prefer English to French, and that most of his target readership was common people and not the uh, noble class people. Moreover, Chaucer legitimized the literary use of the Middle English and clearly indicated in his prologue to the Canterbury Tales that speaking French already started to decline in the last couple of decades of 14th century, and it was only spoken at Stratford at Bow and fashionably spoken in other parts of England by prigs like the prioress in the prologue. Above all, it was Chaucer's genuine and sincere love for the vernacular at home that his major works were in English that marked the transition from Middle English to modern English. Apart from Chaucer, John Wycliffe was also highly influenced by this Act of 1362. Wycliffe and Lollards began to translate Bible in the 70s of the century into Middle English dialect to make it easily accessible to the laity. The next significant historical incident that I would mention here is the Hundred Years' War that was caused primarily on account of the turmoil with regard to the claim of succession to the throne of France after King Louis X died in 1316. The period of 100 years war is actually more than 100 years, the tenure being from 1337 to 1453, with some occasional and intermittent truces such as during the plague years. The war continued, in which five generations of kings from two rival dynasties fought for the kingship to the kingdom of France. The reason why I am referring to this Hundred Years' War between France and England is that it had cost dear to English treasury um, in the following decades after the Black Death in England. Secondly, this was one of the couple of prime reasons. Another reason is, of course, the Black Death itself, that England registers a significantly slow pace in the development of cultural and literary practices during this time, compared to what was going on in full swing in Italy, Germany, France, and even Spain at the same time. In order to compensate the treasury and to finance the war against France, a new poll tax was introduced in England in the year 1377 by John of Gaunt, the de facto ruler of England in that year when King Edward III was mortally sick. The tax was levied twice more in 1379 and in 1381 under the kingship of Richard II. However, the proclaimed cause of 1381 poll tax was to restore the feudal system in rural areas of England, who supposedly suffered immense loss for their service to the crown and contribution in the war which was still underway. It was starkly against the interest of the farmers of England, who were supposed to pay the tax for a cause that literally went against their own interest. This triggered the Peasants' Revolution of 1381 under the leadership of Wat Tyler. The revolution went rampant hardly for 2 months before it was curbed, but it definitely exerted an immense effect upon the England administration for the time being as well as later. Wat Tyler was called upon for a pact with the king, but he was treacherously killed, murdered by the mayor of London. This incident sparked the fuel, and the agitated peasants went on killing hundreds of government officials, barons and feudal lords. What is important to note is that peasants class people of England proved their power, and their mighty existence was established as the majority among the populace who could not be ignored any longer. Hence, peasants' revolution of 1381 had long-standing impact upon the English politics and history, as well as culture, and in the development of English literature at large. The most significant and immediate socio-cultural impact was that the use of French language marked a remarkably steep decline thereafter, and that the peasants successfully gained a respectable and formidable position in the society. Naturally, it was the time for growth and flourishing of English language and literature in England. Three important names are worth mentioning here, and they are John Gower, William Langland, and the anonymous power poet. John Gower was a man of letters and a personal friend of Geoffrey Chaucer. Gower's 20th century biographer, John H. Fisher, concludes that during 1376 and 1384, both Gower and Chaucer were living very close to each other, and they frequently chatted over prospect of English literature during their time. Actually, Gower was very much doubtful about the development of Middle English in his early career, probably because of his personal association with the royal families of England, among whom he found his admiring readership. Hence, in his early writing career, Gower preferred writing either in Anglo-Norman French or in Latin. Gower wrote his first book, Speculum Meditantis, in French, and his second work, Vox Clementis, was in Latin. According to Fisher, Chaucer convinced Gower to write his third book in English. So Gower composed and published his third book, Confessio Amantis, in English, but that too with a Latin title. It is worth mentioning that both the friends, Gower and Chaucer, had mutually agreed to try experimenting upon and discovering the prospects of iambic tetrameter and iambic pentameter respectively. So you will see Confessio Amantis is in iambic tetrameter, and Chaucer's works such as House of Fame, The Parliament of Fowls, and also the Canterbury Tales were written in iambic pentameter. The next important name I should mention here is William Langland, again a contemporary of Chaucer. He is famous for his Middle English alliterative verse, Pious Plowman. Now, the last important literary figure from the 14th century England I shall mention is the anonymous composer of the poem Pearl. Because of his anonymity, he is known as the Pearl poet. He is also attributed with the credit of composing the famous title Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is therefore also known as the Gawain poet. An important note that I would like to register here is both Langland and the Pearl poet do not seem to have been much imbibed with the Renaissance vibes of their time, unlike Chaucer. But their writings, of course, reflect the indebtedness to the ongoing historical incidents, as I have referred to earlier. Thank you. Thank you for your patience and ear.